Well, we're at at the end. In 37, end of chapter, I'm going to read this again. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes, he returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" And then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in blood. And they had a long robe with sleeves to take to their father and said, "This we have found. Now, whether it is your son's robe or not." And he recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Well, I had read from the Covenant and Conversation, a weekly reading of the Jewish Bible by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. He had some interesting reflections on that end there. And I'd mentioned, last week, the grief of Jacob over losing Joseph and how he was not consoled by his sons and daughters and how he refused to be consoled and said he would go to his grave grieving. Now, Jonathan Sacks, in his commentary, and he names his essay, "Refusing Comfort, Keeping Hope." Refusing comfort, keeping hope. Now, we know that a terrible crime has been committed because we heard the rest of the story. We are not in Jacob's place, not knowing what has happened, only having this bloody robe presented to him. But the listeners from the earliest time would know the backstory. But the character Jacob is in the dark, and he's been presented with this horrible image of the bloody robe, and he recognizes the robe. It's the one that he had given his favorite son Joseph. And then it is Jacob that makes the statement of concluding that Joseph has been torn apart, meaning killed by a wild animal. And the brothers hope that he would draw that conclusion, but he is not consoled in his grief. Now, Rabbi Sacks goes to some other scripture in the Old Testament with which he's much more familiar, and he tells us that there are laws in Judaism which limits the time of grief. Limits the time of grief. It's a Shiva Sheloshim, 1 year. There is no such thing as bereavement for which grief is endless. He tells us that the Talmud says that God admonishes one who weeps beyond the appointed time with this statement, "You are not more compassionate than I," the words of God, to those that would grieve for too long. And yet, Jacob still refuses to be comforted, even though that is in the tradition, not at the time of the story, but the listeners would hear this and know that. So how can a patriarch of the faith violate this principle of the faith? How can he be set up as an example of the faith to follow if he's a bad example? How could that be? Why is that in the story, in the text? Well, the Midrash gives a remarkable explanation, writes Rabbi Sacks, and he quotes, "One can be comforted for one who is dead, but not for one who is still living." In other words, Jacob refused to be comforted because he had not yet given up hope that Joseph was still alive. Now that statement seems to be contradicting his statement, surely he's been torn apart. So when we have contradictions, it means we have to think deeper. We have to look for other things that might shed light on that contradiction. Tragically, that is the fate of those, Sachs says, who have lost a loved one, the parents of missing soldiers in action. They're missing, they're presumed dead, but there's no evidence. And so as long as there is a possibility, as remote as it might be, that he or she is still alive, then they cannot go through the normal stages of grief. The earliest stages of grief, we know, are first of all shock and disbelief. It can't be so. It doesn't seem right. And so this just can't be true. And it takes a while to get past the shock and then accept that the one that we loved has died. And the way that disbelief and shock, or the disbelief part, is overcome is when you go and see the body that no longer has life in it. And so that helps one then make the beginning of the process of grieving the loss and making the adjustments to not having this one with you. But there must be something wrong when there's no strong evidence that it's a reality. And so one gets stuck at that point of the disbelief and cannot move on. And that's the hardest time of the grief sometime, is that first shock and blow. But anyway, continuing their anguish then is seen as a form of loyalty. I will not abandon you. I will not abandon hope. I will keep the vigil. I'll keep lighting the candles. You know, when sometimes when there's some tragedy and we're not sure what's happening, like there's an explosion in a mine and miners are down there and they don't know whether they can be rescued, then people gather and they keep the vigil in order to encourage hope that. And, you know, to show that we're not giving up. We're not assuming that you're dead. We're going to try to rescue you. The same with children that are kidnapped and they've disappeared. You know, you all see in the paper, like I do from time to time, the pictures of the children that are missing. And some of them are age progressed. You know, it's been 10 years, it's been 15 years, and we still haven't found them. They were taken, you know, when they're 8 years old or 9 years old, and here's that picture, and then an age-progressed way to use computers to say now that they would be 24, this is probably what they would look like. Have you seen this one? It's a part of the vigil of keeping up the hope. So this is a sense of loyalty. Now, you know, occasionally, and not too long ago, we've, you know, found that those kidnapped young girls are alive. You know, they've been kept prisoner in some place. But sadly, then they discover the bones and then do the test, and then that's the confirmation. But we hear this word closure used a lot in terms of grief and so forth, and often it's a misnomer. A lot of people are using the idea of bringing closure to mean that the grief is over now. You can have closure, therefore you can stop being sad, and now you can be happy. But closure really means the case is closed. We have found the body. There is evidence to determine what happened. Either we have evidence to charge someone with murder, and then if we can bring them to justice, then there's a chance to bring closure to this case. Or in finding a body, sometimes there's evidence that this was a suicide, or this was a tragic accident. Sometimes they find a car that's in a pond where somebody has accidentally gone off the road and the car is submerged. They didn't know what happened to them. They just disappeared. Well, now case closed. They know what happened. But the grieving and the loss and the feeling sad about the tragedy does not end. There's always that heartache, but we learn to live with it, and it lessens to some degree, but it never goes away. However, in Jacob's case, we do not hear him protest that Joseph may be still alive. He himself seems to have accepted as a fact that Joseph was dead when he saw the blood-stained robe, and says surely he's been torn apart. But Rabbi Sachs takes us deeper into the story. He points out that the words that the brothers say to Joseph when they present the blood-stained robe were hakar na, which literally means identify please. They bring the robe and hakar na to their dad, identify please. Now that phrase is a quasi-legal phrase, and we're given a similar passage that uses the phrase in Exodus 10, and Rabbi Sachs does a translation here. And you all, if you've read the Old Testament, you've probably read passages like this, but it's all the legality of what you do with borrowing each other's animals or accidentally killing each other's animals and whatnot. But anyway, this passage is Exodus 22, 10-13. If a man gives a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to his neighbor for safekeeping, and it dies, or is injured, or is taken away while no one is looking, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay hands on the other person's property. If the animal was torn to pieces by a wild animal, he shall bring the remains as evidence, and he will not be required to pay for the torn animal. So the issue at stake here is the extent of responsibility borne by a guardian, a shomer. If the animal is lost through negligence, then it's the guardian's fault. I mean, let's say you have a pet puppy, and someone's going to house sit for you and take care of your puppy. You don't want to put it take it to the vet and put it in there and have it maybe get that kennel cough and whatnot. And so you come back home, you say, "Where's my puppy?" And they're so sad. The puppy's dead. Well, how did it die? Well, I was slamming the door when I was going out and I crushed him and he died. Well, how are you going to feel about that? I left you to take care of my puppy. So if you accidentally killed the puppy, what would you do? If you're a responsible person, you'd say, "Let me buy you a new one. I am so sorry. I want to replace it. It was my fault." Or, if you were gone and you had it wasn't a puppy, but it was a big dog, and the person was house sitting, but they weren't there the whole time. They, had to go someplace. They came back. A burglar broke in and shot the dog. Well, would you feel the same way as if you had accidentally killed the dog? No, you wouldn't. I mean, the burglar did it. And, the house was locked and it was safe, but they still broke in. And anyway, so it's a question of fault and liability for the loss and who should make restitution. Now, if on the other hand there is no negligence, merely the force majeureuse, or however that's pronounced, I guess it's a French word or expression that I don't know French. Anyway, an unavoidable, unforeseeable accident, as insurance policies say, act of God, as unforeseen and unavoidable, then the guardian is exempt from blame and exempt from liability. Now, one such case in the Hebrew in the Old Testament times was the case of the loss was caused by a wild animal that's on the prey and kills your goat or your sheep or a fox in the hen house. But the wording of the teroph yit arif, torn to pieces, is exactly the phrase of Jacob's statement about Joseph's bloody robe, the teroph Yosef. Joseph has been torn to pieces. It's in that same legal jargon of these other passages. Now, Sachs says that we know such a law existed before the giving of the Torah. So this is, before Moses and all the laws. But the laws in the Torah were not brand new, dreamed up at the time, but all of the principles and practices that got written down in the law for all these interactions between people had been evolving through the communal life and the tribal lives, and had gained a little bit of sophistication and understanding just from human experiences of the community. Now, obviously, Jacob, living with Laban, was a long time prior to Moses' laws, and we read there in Genesis 31:39 where Jacob is defending his honor after Laban has chased him down and caught him after he ran away, saying, "You stole my household gods." And finally, Jacob stands up to Laban and he says he did not, and he's an honorable man, and he is explaining that while he was in Laban's household, working for Laban, and had been placed in charge of all of Laban's flocks, that, quote, "I did not bring your animals torn by the wild beasts," meaning whenever one of them was killed by a wolf or a lion or whatever, he did not bring the carcass to Laban and say, "I am innocent, it was a wild animal, so when you do your accounting of how many sheep that I'm supposed to return to you after I've pastured them, if you see that there's one short, here's the carcass, a wild animal killed it." He said, "I never did that. I always replaced it. I always replaced it upon my own. So if I'm going to do that, why in the world would I steal your stupid household gods?" is the argument there. But it goes back to this idea of the guardian is responsible for the animal or whatever they're a guardian of, and if they're liable, then they have to be held accountable. But the way to be innocent is to provide evidence, the carcass, that a wild animal caused the death and disappearance. So, Sachs goes on to say that an elder brother carried a similar responsibility for the fate of a younger brother placed in his charge. Even it was assumed if the two of them were alone and nobody's watching, the older brother is supposed to take care of and is accountable for the younger and his safety. Now this is the irony and the significance of Cain's denial when confronted by God as to the fate of Abel. "Where is your brother?" And he uses the word, "Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my brother's guardian?" The shofar, or shomer, "Am I my brother's guardian?" When he's saying he's missing, so how is he missing? You produce, if he's killed by a wild animal, you produce the carcass, but then, the blood in the ground is crying out against you for his death. Anyway, all of these references are in the minds of the listeners to these stories and narratives as they hear them. And now we can hear that way as we are reminded of those passages. And we see the connections. So normally the older brother, not just Reuben, the eldest, but every other brother down to Joseph. So all of them are accountable, should be guardians of Joseph. And all of them failed if Joseph is not returned, and all of them bear the guilt for the disappearance of Joseph. Now, to avoid the guilt, as is the case with the biblical law, they should have brought the mangled remains of Joseph. I mean, if they found the bloody robe that he was wearing, there should have been some physical evidence of parts of his body, because they could not. I mean, he wouldn't have been laying out there that many days or weeks to be totally devoured. And even so, they could have found some bones. But anyway, they did not present evidence in that sense that he was actually torn apart by a wild animal, and that would show the cause of the death, and then they could be deemed innocent, as it were, of wrongdoing. Now, their request of Jacob, Hakar Na, must be construed as the legal request, meaning examine the evidence, the little bit of evidence we're presenting. And with the little bit of evidence, Jacob has no alternative but to acquit them on this circumstantial evidence, the absence of a body. However, even though there is no evidence to convict, the weak evidence still leaves doubt. Legally, one is innocent until proven guilty, as we have in our country, that philosophy and idea. But doubt and distrust will still remain in people's minds. Because the glove wouldn't fit, O.J. was not proven guilty, but nearly everybody believed he was guilty. But the circumstantial evidence, there weren't eyewitnesses, they couldn't prove it, but the big doubt and question was in people's minds. So Sachs says that, in fact, Jacob did not believe the brothers were innocent, and his refusal to be comforted shows that he is unconvinced. And Sachs goes on to say, Jacob continued to hope that Joseph was still alive, and then at the end of the story they are reunited and so forth. However, he doesn't go on to another thought that I have about this. After reading all of this, I would suggest that these sons and daughters that tried to comfort Jacob for the death of Joseph, but and failed, another reason that he was not able to be comforted may be a deeper grief in his heart. He may have actually believed, yes, Joseph is dead. But why is he dead and how is he dead? He doesn't know, but he is knowing in his heart that his sons, Joseph's brothers, have killed him. And now essentially they're lying through their teeth by presenting the circumstantial evidence to make it look like. And so if he believes that these other sons killed the favorite son, of course they are not going to be able to comfort him and make him stop grieving, because he's not just grieving the death of Joseph, he's grieving the loss of trust and positive feeling for these other sons. He is ashamed of them when a father should be proud of his children. And so he's grieving the loss. And so he has lost not just Joseph, he's lost the rest of them because of what they have done. And so, of course, he cannot be comforted, particularly by them. But anyway, that's my input. Rabbi Sachs didn't think about that, or he's written it in another place, but it's not in that essay. But he goes on to tell us that this refusal to be comforted is a recurring theme in the Hebrew Scriptures, and partly he wanted to get on to that, and that's a very interesting analysis, and I'm going to read, what he says. The refusal to be comforted sounded more than once in Jewish history. The prophet Jeremiah heard it in a later age, and we have this quote from Jeremiah 31. This is what the Lord says, a voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and great weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted, because her children are no more. This is what the Lord says, restrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for your work will be rewarded, says the Lord. They will return from the land of the enemy. So there is hope for your future, declares the Lord. Your children will return to their own land. Now, why was Jeremiah sure the Jews would return? He was sure they would return because they refused to be comforted, meaning they refused to give up hope. So it was during the Babylonian exile, as articulated in one of the most paradigmatic expressions of refusal to be comforted, and you all are familiar with this, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept as we remembered Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord in a strange land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem above my highest joy, in Psalm 137. And then he has this other quote. He says, It is said that Napoleon, passing a synagogue on a fast day of Tisha B'Av, heard the sounds of lamentation. And he asked, what are the Jews crying for? And the answer was, for Jerusalem, a soldier replied. How long ago did they lose it? Napoleon asked. More than 1,700 years ago. A people who can mourn for Jerusalem so long will one day have it restored to them, the emperor is reputed to have said. Well, the Jews are people who refuse to be comforted because they never gave up hope. Jacob did eventually see Joseph again. Rachel's children did return to the land. Jerusalem is once again a Jewish home. All the evidence may suggest otherwise. It may seem to signify irretrievable loss, a decree of history that cannot be overturned, a fate that must be accepted. But the Jews never believed the evidence because they had something else to set against it, a faith, a trust, an unbreakable hope that proved stronger than historical inevitability. And a part of that was the refusal to assimilate and be lost. They held on to the hope, so they held on to the identity of themselves as a people, held on to their separate customs. Anyway, a trust, a faith, an unbreakable hope. It is not too much to say that Jewish survival was sustained in that hope. And that hope came from a simple, or perhaps not so simple, phrase in the life of Jacob. He refused to be comforted. And so, while we still live in a world scarred by violence, poverty, injustice, we must refuse to be comforted and never give up and never accept what is that's not right, but still hope for that brighter day when things can be restored or will be as they're meant to be. Now, you would think, after we deal with that, he cannot be comforted, and then meanwhile the Midianites had sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. We would go right down to Egypt and see what's going to happen next. But we don't. We have the 38th chapter that just kind of slides in here, And I was reading one of the other commentaries on it that was explaining why did they stick it in here. Obviously, it does not fit the flow of the story of Joseph. And is explaining that there really isn't a better place to put it, but it's an important story for the patriarchs, and finally getting down to King David later on, that this story is integral to the whole story, but it was not a part of the Joseph story. It had to be put someplace. So this was a logical place in the sense that Joseph is carried down to Egypt. He's going to be there for a while as a slave and developing his place from a slave to be the chief CFO and CEO of Pharaoh's empire. So it's going to take some time for that to evolve. So meanwhile, back at the ranch, we've got this story happening. 38:1. It happened at that time that Judah went down away from his brothers to settle near a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hirah. And there Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. It was Shua's daughter. And he married her, and he went into her. She conceived, and she bore a son, and he named him Again she conceived and bore a son, whom she named. Judah named first son and she named second son Onan. I didn't catch that before. Yet again she bore a son, and she named him Shelah. She was in Jabez when she bore him. Judah took a wife for his firstborn. Now, a bunch of years pass instantly here, and her name was Tamar. Now, we don't get Shua's daughter's name mentioned, but we get Tamar's name given. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. And then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, it says he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. So it was coitus interruptus as a birth control method that he was exercising, and that was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. And then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." In other words, he sends her home. For Judah feared that Shelah would die also like his brothers. He thought Tamar was the curse. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Now at this point, we don't know why died, what he did. He was wicked in the sight of the Lord, who put him to death. What do you think he might have done that God killed him? Well, a lot of people have tried to read into it. He must have done something terrible. But one of the commentators said, we've got the cause and effect, and the horse and the cart are kind of mixed up. When in these times, when there was an untimely death or a disease and so forth, the main point isn't that the person did something unhealthy or it was an accident. These untimely deaths were understood that God is in control of everything, and if someone dies young, then God made them die, and if God made them die, there had to be a reason, and so they must have done something terribly wicked for God to punish them that way. So it the issue of what he did wrong is not really the key point here. It's that he had died young from something. And if he died young, then it was God's will. God caused it. And so the reason is he was bad. We don't know how. It doesn't matter. He was bad. So God killed him. That's why he died. So then we move on with the story. We know what Onan was doing. Some people have used this to condemn masturbation and say it's evil, evil, God will kill you, or it's so terrible, God will kill you. But it wasn't masturbation. It was coitus interruptus, and it wasn't so much that was a evil thing, but that was the means by which he was avoiding fulfilling the Levirate responsibility, and that he was being greedy and selfish for himself and not being loyal and responsible to the family needs and for the production of children and honoring his brother's name. Those were the higher honors and values in the culture. And it didn't matter which way he would have. He might have just not ever gone in to be with her. He might have run away instead of having to marry her. But then God still would have killed him, because that was the evil that he was doing that was being recognized as wrong in the minds and understanding at this time. So she goes off to the father's house as a way of getting rid of her, because she's a curse on this family. Was it because she was a Canaanite? Well, Shua's daughter was a Canaanite, and there's no concern there. Remember the big, with the rape of Dinah, and then the Levi and Simeon going and killing off Shechem's family and all, because in revenge. And a part of the thought there was this was a strong statement against outmarriage, marrying out of our tribe and marrying those awful Canaanites. Here, Judah goes down, and Judah is the tribe that's going to survive and become Israel, or the children of Israel. There's no negative word or thought expressed about marrying Canaanite women. It's no big deal in this passage at this time. Anyway, so the story goes on. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. Still doesn't give her a name. When Judah's time of mourning was over, less than a year, because we've been dealing with that, he went up to Timnah to the sheep shearers, he and his friend Hirah, the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear sheep, she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance of Enim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up now, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. And when Judah, that's why she's gone out there, because she already knew that. It wasn't that she just discovered it right then at that moment. But anyway, when Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Now, where have I put it? Dana Fuel's commentary on this story is very interesting, and she comments that covering her face would not indicate her being a prostitute. Prostitutes were shameless. They were not modest, and so they wouldn't be covering their face. If she was wearing a veil, she would be like Rebecca wearing a veil, and the veil is a sign of either a maiden or a young woman ready to be married. She's eligible for marriage. So anyway, this seems to be giving a different image. So He saw her, and he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. And he went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And another comment Fuel makes is, she has been so distanced from him and disregarded by him, he didn't recognize her when he should have recognized her, even with the veil. She said, "Well, what will you give me that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. And then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on her garments of her widowhood. And when Judah sent the kid by a friend, the Adullamite, to recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. And he asked the townspeople, "Where is the temple prostitute who was at Enaim by the wayside?" Now this is the first time we put temple in front of the word prostitute. And that's got a whole bunch of questions we have to ask. But anyway, but they said, "No prostitute has been here," which is an interesting thing. If she was sitting out there and looked like a prostitute, then other people would have said, "Oh yeah, we saw her." But this was all in the mind of or mostly in the mind of Judah. So anyway, so the Adullamite returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her. Moreover, the townspeople said, 'No prostitute has been here,'" which is an interesting statement. The witness of the community is, she is not a prostitute. But anyway, Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, otherwise we will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid, and you could not find her." So about 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of her whoredom." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." It's interesting here in this verse, he has responsibilities to her, and he takes all these years and never fulfills them. And here she's caught, he thinks. He's going to act immediately. He's not going to delay. He's going to get rid of her quickly. Anyway, as she is being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." And then Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not lie with her again. And when the time of her delivery came, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and bound on his hand a crimson thread, saying, "This one came out first." But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore he was named Perez. Afterward his brother came out with a crimson thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? Chapter 39. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of the Pharaoh, and we get back to Joseph. Well, this is a very fascinating story. Perez becomes in the name of the ancestors of King David. So, anyway, there's a whole lot of things to talk about. In these passages, but we don't have time for that today. Any questions or any comments that you want us to be prepared to discuss next week? Yes. Oh, wouldn't be comforted in his mourning. Yeah. Oh, you thought that Jacob, in not being consoled, was just one of God's people that didn't follow the rules. Meaning he was contrary, and he just was, he did a lot of bad things, and this was another bad thing he did. Okay. Well, it always raises that question, because we think the patriarchs ought to be the ideal that are held up as the good example, but as we read carefully and see, they weren't. They were, in some ways, just very normal human beings. But another part of the stories is that this was a developing understanding, and faith is something that goes through developmental processes. There's a beginning, and there's a learning, and there's a growing, and a possibility of maturing and gaining wisdom and gaining self-control. And so sometimes there are places where we're looking at an individual and see the individual faith journey, and then other times that individual then represents the people as a whole and their faith journey into a way of being holy and righteous people. The Babylonian I was just listening to some tapes on the history of Israel and the people, and it was something that I kind of knew, but it was really brought into focus by this lecturer, that there were 3 groups of Israelites who had greatly different understandings of the faith. With the Babylonian captivity, the educated and the upper classes were carried off into captivity. You know, how can we sing songs by the river of Babylon when Jerusalem is destroyed? And Ezekiel had created in his prophetic words an image of the chariot of God going across the skies, and the chariot meant God can go with the people. You know, until then, everybody thought their God controlled this piece of real estate. And if they left that piece of real estate, then they had to worship the gods that controlled other pieces of real estate. They still believed in their God, but they accepted other gods. Well, this exile helped the Israelites to realize a whole different relationship with God without the temple, without the homeland, and develop the synagogue worship and so forth. But there was that group, and they felt like the exile had purified them through the terrible experience. Then there were those who didn't get exiled, but they fled, and they went down to Egypt, and they built a temple, and they worshiped God there that way. And then there were the people, the poorest people on the land, and a part of, in the prophetic words, we understand that some of the wealthy folks enslaved their own people and stole their property to build their big estates. And so when they get carted off, these poor people who are left in the land, they can repossess the land. And they continue to offer sacrifices and worship God at the destroyed temple, because it was, even though destroyed, it was still holy ground. So they didn't think Yahweh had left. To them, Yahweh didn't get on that chariot and go off to be with the people. So each of these groups had different understandings of the faith. And so from their different experiences, and they learned things, but then trying to bring that all back together shows differences and learnings that have to be reconciled and brought together. And part of that is purity. We don't intermarry with others, which would have been those in exile. Keep it tight and pure. Whereas back here, well, we've been marrying these folks off and on, all the time. No big deal. It happens. So anyway, well, let's close with a word of prayer, and we'll deal with more of that next time. Dear God, we thank you for all the ways you bless us, and that you do not give up on us, and you try to help us learn and grow in our faith through the experiences that we have. In Christ's name, amen.